Right, doesn't end the song. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third annual Assembly on Organizing for Ethnic Studies with Washington Ethnic Studies Now. I am Tracy Castro-Gill, and I am a co-founder and the executive director of Washington Ethnic Studies Now. We sometimes refer to as WAESN. Actually, we mostly refer to it as WAESN because that's easier to say. So we have Dr. Velez with us, but first we're going to do just an introduction to who we are as Washington Ethnic Studies Now. But we'll start with a land acknowledgement and remind us that all learning happens on Indigenous land. And so I'm coming to you from the stolen and occupied land of the Duwamish people and the Coast Salish people here in Seattle. And so I encourage you, if you don't know where you're coming from, to go and research that. Whose land you are occupying. But if you know it, if you could drop that in the chat so we know where you are, I'd love to see where people are joining us from. And so a land acknowledgement, of course, is never enough. We have to work towards decolonization, and that's part of what we're here to do today, to decolonize education. And I want to remind us that true decolonization doesn't happen until land repatriation happens and Indigenous people are given the right to occupy and own and steward their own land again. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the stolen and exploited labor that built this country on the backs of people of color, enslaved African people, exploited labor of Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Latin Americans, Chicanos, all of us who have our ancestors built this land for free from stolen labor or exploited and died to build this country. I also want to acknowledge that we stand on the shoulders of the people who come before us to fight for ethnic studies. So here are two images from two standout movements in the fight for ethnic studies in the United States. The one on the left is the strikes of the San Francisco State University, demanding ethnic studies and Black studies with the Third World Liberation Front in 1968. And on the right, in 2011, our students from Tucson High School protesting the ban of the Raza Studies program that was shut down by a racist lawmaker and later overturned by the Arizona State Supreme Court. Unfortunately, it was too late for the educators who were doing an amazing job there, but their story didn't end there, and their story is connected to our story. So I want to share that we stand on their shoulders. Washington Ethnic Studies Now, how we started. I was working for Seattle Public Schools as the Ethnic Studies Program Manager at the time. That's what this top left picture is on the top left. And I was doing a professional development during the summer that was open to other school districts, not just for Seattle Public Schools. And in particular, I partnered with Jeff Stone, who is the ethnic studies lead for Edmonds School District. And we really started to realize that there are so many educators out there doing ethnic studies or trying to do ethnic studies on their own, either siloed and or in hostile environments under attack. And so Jeff and I started to intentionally partner to create more opportunities. This middle picture, that's me, Jeff, Jesse Hagopian, Lisa Rice, Dr. Waynau, Shraddha Sharude, Usana Hall, and Caitlin Kamale Brandon. We did some work at the Northwest Teaching for Social Justice conference together. And then down here on the bottom right is when Jeff Stone and I partnered to bring the Shito Collective, which are the folks from Tucson, into Seattle as a learning opportunity for educators in the Seattle region. So our first assembly happened 3 years ago in 2019, and it was because Dr. Curtis Acosta from the Tucson Raza Studies program, he came to help us organize our first assembly, him and his colleagues at Acosta Educational Partnership. So this is Dr. Acosta, this is Dr. Kinoshita, who was at the time the chief of curriculum and instruction for Seattle Public Schools, Alma Ramiro Alonso, who was an elementary school educator, and Jennifer Dunn, who is a high school educator in Seattle Public Schools. And this is them planning our first ever assembly. And that first assembly was by invitation only, because so many of us were still under attack at the time, and we wanted to prevent, you know, trolls and haters from coming. And so this bottom right picture is that first assembly. There were about 40 folks there. The NAACP Youth Council was part of that. And then, of course, educators from across Western Washington. So from there, we got a list of people who were like, okay, let's do something with this. Like, we have some momentum. What are we going to make of it? So we started meeting monthly. And this is one of our meetings. We used to meet at KEXP Cafe downtown in Seattle. And we were meeting with Senator Hasegawa to talk about some legislation for anti-racist professional development. And so from there, we started thinking, well, if we want to like have some leverage and actually push this on a statewide level, we need a platform. And so that's when we were started talking about creating a nonprofit organization. And so that's where we are now. Shortly after this picture was taken, we created a 501c4, which allows us to engage in political advocacy. And then we had our second assembly, and that one was open to the public, and it was very well attended. And we said, okay, we want to intentionally make this not about the traditional education conference. It's for networking and support. We want to build a community, which is like the #1 goal of Washington Ethnic Studies now, is to have community for people who are doing the work. So y'all don't have to be alone, and you have resources and you have support. So what do? We recently held an opt-out clinic, so we're starting to expand into how to support community and not just educators. So we helped parents figure out how to opt their students out of standardized testing, because as we all, I'm sure, agree, standardized testing is harmful and antithetical to ethnic studies. We do legislative action. We can do informative and educational events. We have our monthly roundtable, which is on hold for this month because of the assembly. But all of those are posted on our YouTube channel. So if you're interested in watching our roundtable conversations, you can check out our YouTube channel. We do social media campaigns. So this was during Black History Month, reminding folks that African enslavement is white history and not Black history. We have a professional development series. You can join there. We have them every first, second, and third Saturday of the month, but we also contract with school districts to do professional development. We support educators. Every single person on our board, our executive board, are educators, and so we are very pro-educator. We engage youth as much as possible. And also, like the whole community and networking thing, we have something that we call our In Lakesh fellowship meetings once a quarter. So they're seasonal. We're having one tomorrow. So I am going to drop that link in the chat. Usually it's only for members. So if you're on our email list, you get an invitation to register for this. And this is just an hour-long meeting to connect and meet with people and build a network. It's free. We go by themes. So tomorrow's theme is reflection, identity and agency, which matches our framework. And we're going to be talking about the anti-Asian violence that's been happening in our communities because of COVID anti-Asian rhetoric. We also create content. So we have our ethnic studies frameworks. And so on the left is a graphic that represents the work that we do. And on the right is a list of all the frameworks we've created. And I just have to give a huge shout out to the framework authors, because they volunteered their time over this school year on top of all of the wild pandemic, online, in-person, hybrid stuff going on. They still managed to volunteer their time and put their passion and love and heart into these frameworks. And so I want to give a shout out to everyone who contributed to that. So again, today's purpose is to network. So if you're in a breakout room and you connect with somebody, make sure you get their contact information. We're here to organize because we know from history, those first couple of images, that this is a fight. When we say we're fighting for ethnic studies, that's not hyperbole. You know, many people went to jail, many people lost their jobs, myself included. And so we are here to organize so that we can be in community and hold each other up. And then to engage, figure out, you know, where are the existing efforts? How can you plug into existing efforts? How can you create your own efforts where you are in building that community? If you're not already a WAESN member, to become a WAESN member, all you have to do is get on our email list. Like, that's literally, there's no fee for that. You get on our email list and you're invited to those In Lakesh meetings. You're one of the first people to know when we have a new event. So make sure that you do that, or you can follow us on Facebook. Well, not or you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at WA Ethnic Studies, and our YouTube is the same. So today, make sure you're using your hyperlinked agenda to choose your own adventure. Last year, we tried registering people for specific breakouts, and that did not go so well. So luckily, between last year and this year, Zoom added the function where you can choose your own breakout. So that's what we'll be doing today. Some breakouts have their own dedicated link. Some breakouts, you'll go to a link and then have to join the breakout you want to join. So it just depends on what you pick, but use your PDF that I sent you, your agenda. And again, make sure to collect contact information if you want to network with folks. Amanda Hubbard, board president, is our dedicated support person this morning. So if you're having an issue, please reach out to her, or you can email me. Amanda might be more responsive because I'm also leading a breakout session today. The breakout sessions, by the way, repeat, so it's not like ongoing. The only exception to that is in the afternoon. The BIPOC Healing Circle is a 2-hour-long session instead of a 1-hour-long session, and we please ask that you only join that if you identify as Black, Indigenous, or another person of color. Both the morning keynotes and the afternoon keynotes will be recorded and posted on our WAESN YouTube channel, but we will not be recording breakouts. And the assembly ends after breakout 3 because I'm really bad about wrapping things up and I just didn't build it into the agenda. So we'll say goodbye at the end of the afternoon keynote, and then after us breakout 3, we'll be finished. So my phone's blowing up, so I want to make sure I'm not missing anything important. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Velez for our morning keynote. So let me stop my share and I'll turn off my camera.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Let me get myself situated here. Good morning, everyone. I was really hoping we would have sunshine today, you know, because I was thinking like how special it would be if the sun just continued. But, you know, we're going to just welcome the rain. It's all right. So good morning, everyone. My name is Veronica Velez. I prefer to go by Vero. I'm going to share a little bit about my own communities, but oftentimes when I hear my full name, I feel like I'm in trouble for something. I feel like my mom is in the background sort of yelling at me, Veronica, and I'm just like, okay, we're just gonna go with Vero because I have these moments of these memories of when I was little, when my full name was used. So, so first I just want to say I'm coming to you from Lummi and Nooksack territories and sort of a transplant here from California. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my California roots in a bit, but I first want to start by thanking the organizers for this invitation, especially to Tracy and Amanda, who I've been connecting quite a bit, and also Sulan, if you're here, also shout out to you. I've had the opportunity to connect with in pretty special ways over the last couple months, and just honored to be here and to be in this space. It actually reminds me so much of the work and the communities I was a part of in California, and I've been kind of missing that in the Pacific Northwest. Though I have been here for 8 years, admittedly, and trying to find my way back into community spaces. But anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about those struggles too, because I think it's important that we honor sort of the complexities of this work, and sometimes where we find ourselves in sort of spaces that we didn't, particularly imagine being in. So to start, I wanted to say, when I first received this invitation, I have to admit I was in the midst of navigating pretty challenging roles to consider how we bring ethnic studies into higher ed, specifically at Western Washington University, which is where I'm at, and into K-12. I found myself in conversations where the tensions were running really high about how do we insert ethnic studies into places whose very architecture was designed to distort and deny our very existence as BIPOC communities. In so many ways that this task has felt irreconcilable. Is this even possible? Can these two projects align? Those roles in my anchor in the academy placed me in constant conversation with institutional stakeholders, spending countless hours negotiating and considering how my humanity could become palatable to those in power. So these types of projects I'm finding are becoming more and more frequent in the uprise of ethnic studies, particularly in the context of the state wanting to take on ethnic studies. And because my training is in critical race theory, I became very much interested in figuring out how do we shift the institutional and the political terrain so that we can redistribute university resources to support the liberatory projects outside of its walls. But as I did, I found myself becoming disconnected from the communities and the lessons that first propelled me down a path to learn more about what informs injustice so that I can work more effectively against it. So today, in that spirit, I wanted to take us back home, so to speak, to the very communities that are the driving force of this work. So also in preparation, so I thought, okay, I'm going to center my work on community-driven praxis, and then I thought, here I am, professor. I began thinking about all the different sort of archives that I have in terms of all these beautiful community movements that have informed the work. And then I thought to myself, oh gosh, Vero, you're becoming, here you are engaging in this professorial thing, this frustration that I have with other academics who sometimes think the 3 letters after their last name confuses them into believing that they're experts. So I kind of had to ask myself, who did I think I was, right? That in 30 minutes, I could capture the totality of movements that sort of frame this work. But then I remembered that I actually come from a community who value and cares for one another, no matter the obstacle. I come from a community that runs deep in intergenerational wisdom, carried by the strengths of our mothers. I come from courageous border crossers that have made new homes far and from original ones but remain connected to what is most important. I come from callous hands that overflow with generosity, and I come from struggles that symbolize decades of community healing, often overlooked. And I come from families that are more than just blood related. So this memory is what propelled me to frame my talk today and frame my remarks to each of you. It's more about an intimate journey in and with community that have shaped my relationship to ethnic studies, both in the why, but more importantly in the how. And it is a humble and generous sharing of lessons learned, unfinished reflections, and principles of practice. So in that spirit, I want to start with one of the first lessons, and this is of the importance of educación. And I'm going to be also sharing connected to each of these lessons of dicho. Dichos are sort of like everyday common sayings. Most folks in the room might recognize these in different forms. Those little words of wisdom that our families would often share with us, that would kind of stick with you, right? They're just remembered. So the one that I share that opens this one is "Lo que bien se aprende nunca se olvida," which means a lesson well learned is never forgotten. And so what I wanted to start in the concept of educación, the notion of educación for me, is something that is really important in my own sort of understanding of who I am as an educated person. And now some folks in the room may know this as sometimes when we greet each other, say goodbye, carry a conversation. Being bien educada is something that no number of degrees will earn you that respect. Something that my mom still likes to remind me when I go home and I'm on the phone too much when we're at dinner. Being bien educada means valuing togetherness. This often means, like, when for in my family, when it's time to say goodbye to primos and tías and tíos, that we're often inching closer to the door than we are to the car. It's about a 2-hour goodbye. It's those moments when we're asked to leave the comalan, to heat up that tortilla, even though we don't know who might need it. It's the ways that we care for each other, recognize each other's humanity in a space. So for me as a 5-year-old, which is roughly about the time of this picture, these are the cultural understandings that was always being praised for. I was always being told I was una hija tan bien educada. I was a daughter that was so well educated in that way. And this doesn't quite translate educación to educated, but in that sense of, that I was upholding those cultural practices. And it was these pedagogies of the home that reminded me to this day that education has to be more than simply acquiring technical skills for a narrow set of employment. It also reminds me that I was educated long before I entered school. But these social skills were not equally valued in my first grade classroom. My talkative 5-year-old self apparently wouldn't shut up, and my mother was called in by my teacher. Like many children of immigrants, I served as a translator. And being the smartass that I was, I decided to use this to my advantage. So as the teacher began telling my mother that I was too social and not following her instructions, I confidently turned to my mother and said, "Mi maestra dice que soy la mejor alumna de la clase." My teacher says that I'm the best student in the class. My mother smiled to try to push away the guilt for being so malcriada, because I would rather get the ice cream I knew I was going to be rewarded for my quote unquote good behavior, and not the regañada or the punishment I really deserved. But in her quiet demeanor and her disposition, I recognized something that had become all too familiar even at a young age: the stigma my parents felt for not knowing how to speak English. So as I translated verbally, I also translated emotionally, sensing the disdain and judgment in my mother's and my teacher's voice at my mother for not assimilating, and the frustration, sadness, and shame my mother felt that could not be overcome by my little white lie. It was one of the first memories where I can remember rage. Now, I recall this memory often because it reminds me that the struggles my family and I went through weren't because we didn't work hard enough or because I wasn't smart enough. In fact, I think I was more of a smartass than I would like to admit. Understanding my history, that of my family, seeing it for what it was in its most critical light, allows me to heal from the pain of adapting to a world that didn't want us. I look back at that moment in my first grade classroom when my commitment to justice was born, and understood what Gloria Anzaldúa speaks of when she says that we could be the healing of the wound. And out of that day, out of that rage was born love. Out of that love was born a commitment. Nonetheless, my journey in the aftermath of schooling sought to take me away from these pedagogies of the home. Though I didn't have the language then, I knew in my 6-year-old rage that schools are actively working to subtract our language and our culture, to deculturize us and envelop us in white stream ideologies. Though I remain committed to doing my mother justice throughout my life, it's why I later became a grassroots organizer working with migrant mothers. It was challenging to resist how the mediation of school often took me further and further from the lessons of home. And so I want to share just a couple more slides connected to my mother, because I want to recognize the genius that she is, and how, 40 years later, so my mother would not be happy about showing this picture. She'd be like, "Mija, this is a terrible picture of me," but I'm gonna share it anyway. This is our little backyard in LA, in Pasadena, California, which is where I'm born and raised. And I remember growing up, my mom always, I feel like many Mexican families in the neighborhood, always had something growing in the backyard that was edible, right? And my mom's pride and joy was her su árbol de mandarina, like her oranges, her sus nopales that are in the background. These are the kinds of things. And I remember growing up feeling so frustrated because I would come home from school hungry, and my mom was just left to be covered in dirt. And I share this because, so much of schooling took me away from spending time with my mom in the backyard, learning about the stories from her hometown in Ciudad Guzman. It's a small town outside of Guadalajara, Estado de Jalisco, Mexico, of learning about the ways that she worked and her relationship to land, the relationship to coming from a farm working family. This was not something I was interested. I became less interested over time until last year, when I decided to finally acclimate and become part of the Pacific Northwest and start my own little garden, humble as it may be in these pictures, right? And sure enough, I called my mom and I said, "Mommy, I need to learn how to do this," because I didn't pay attention when I was a child. And of course, my mom's like, "Now you want to learn, 40-some-year-old, after all those years, I've been trying to get you to learn about these things, and now you want to learn." So anyway, she starts to share these stories, and she starts to teach me about land, and she starts to teach me about my tíos, and she starts to teach me about these plants, and she starts to teach me about science, and she starts to teach me about all these things that I had no idea. Within a short few weeks, my garden turned from humble to lush. I had more tomatoes and tomatillos and chiles that I didn't even know what to do with, right? And so I think about this because even as somebody who has moved far from home and is thinking about these questions of ethnic studies, I come back to these stories of my own community, of my family, to remind myself, right, that what oftentimes our search for ethnic studies is sometimes it's a journey back to ourselves. It's a journey back to what has been taken from us, what we have been dispossessed from in the most intimate ways. And I have to ask every time I look at these pictures and the conversations with my mom, and in the story of when I was 6 years old, I have to ask, who am I uninterrupted? How do I even begin to answer that question? And for me, ethnic studies has always been that journey to answer that question, right? But it's in these stories. And I oftentimes wonder, had my first grade teacher recognized the genius in my mother, the mathematical and scientist that my mother is, maybe I would have never become disconnected from those stories, right? So I want to start with that, the importance of educación as a community-driven praxis in the work we do in ethnic studies. Now, the second lesson I want to bring to you all is the importance of, how do we build community to cultivate joy? And here I share the dicho, no más atole con el dedo. And I'll explain this in a bit when I share about the mothers, or I'll explain it now because I think it's important as a framing. But this was a dicho that I was a grassroots organizer for 15 years working with migrant mothers around school reform. And I remember at one point I asked one of the mothers, who we both share the same name, so I call her my tocaya. And, she said to me, I asked her, so what is this organization? What does this group of mothers mean to you in terms of the work you do? And I remember she said to me, Vero, easy, no más atole con el dedo. And I was like, okay, no, we got to explain that. That's a dicho I haven't heard. I want to really kind of understand what that means. And she said to me, well, and all the mothers, as soon as she said no más atole con el dedo, they're like, that's it, Vero, like, that's the answer. That's the answer you were looking for. So they all understood what she was saying, except for me, right? And so when I asked her to explain, and the direct translation doesn't do it justice. It's basically no more atole. Atole is a flour-based drink that's common in Mexican cuisine with the finger. No more atole with the finger. And so she explained to me, she said, when you're a chest-feeding parent, there comes a point where you just get exhausted. You don't want to do it anymore. So you make atole and you rub atole on the baby's lips as a way to give you a break, as a way to pacify the baby, trick the baby, so that you can take a break and not have to respond to the baby's needs. And then she turned to me, she said, that's what the school district has been doing to us all these years. So for us, this organization is no more atole con el dedo. We will no longer be tricked and deceived into stand-ins for real reform. Now I sat back because I had this moment of like, engaging in the spaces of community and the laughter that the mothers were like, hi, Vero, this is, this dicho captures it all. I thought, I could have summarized my 5 years of my doctoral program in that one dicho. She theorized power, resistance, possibility, and all from the flesh. And it still is a memory that centers for me why community as organic intellectuals is so important in the work of ethnic studies. But let me share a little bit more about the organization. So this incredible group, and I share these images with their permission with you all today. This is a group, a mother group that was connected to a large organization known as IDEPSCA. It was the Institute of Popular Education of Southern California, and they were involved in pro-immigrant right campaigns. And then the education arm was always one that was centering families and mothers in particular. And so this work was critical for me in terms of thinking about how, my own sort of coming into movements and coming into engaging with grassroots organizations. This was my entry. And it felt like home because the organization was established within my hometown of Pasadena. But I want to share in particular a memory that I had. So let me go back here. So one of the things that's so important to Apple, and there was Apple for short, even though it has a Spanish name, Asociación de Padres de Pasadena Luchando por la Educación, so Association of Parents, Pasadena Parents Fighting for Education. But one of the things that was so important to them was, again, thinking about it's not enough to arrive at sort of outcomes of a process. We have to be thinking really deeply and attuned to the process in which we engage in to come to our aims of social change. And so one of the things that, watching them engage in these stunning campaigns around popular education, I ended up nominating them for an award in one of our, and at the time I was a doctoral student, so I nominated them for an award at one of our big Educational Research Association meetings. It's sort of the national, for those of you that might know, AERA, sort of a national organization with that's highly esteemed in the academy, right? And it was the Paulo Freire Award, and so they won it this year. This was back in 2008, and I remember they won this award, and I was like, wow, okay, so this is great. Community organizations rarely win these types of awards. And so we were excited, and then I'm like, shoot, the conference is in New Orleans. How are we going to get our butts to New Orleans? We live in Pasadena. So I still remember one of the moms like, oh, no worry, mija, I got a 15-passenger van. We can fit 25 folks and we can drive there. So sure enough, we ended up getting in a van, driving all the way to New Orleans, and we had to go north because we couldn't drive by the border. So it took us an extra 10 hours, took 40 hours to get to New Orleans. But the whole ride to New Orleans, it was the space of just dreaming what could be possible. We had, you can just tell by some of these images, we were cracking up, sharing jokes, living our lives, but also imagining like a world that could exist outside of the current world we live in. So there was so much in these sort of hopes and aspirations of the work of the mothers that ride to New Orleans made evident. And here we were, this is my tocaya Veronica, who's sitting there as I drive. We're still using Thomas Guide. I don't even know if Thomas Guide even exists anymore, but anyway, we were still using Thomas Guide to find our way to the conference, driving there. And then we get to the conference, and I remember we drove basically for 2 days straight. And I had this moment of like, Vero needs to shower, Vero needs to sleep. But they're like, no, mija, we got to get going because we don't have that much time at the conference. And they got there. It was one of those things that, freshened up, and we ran to the conference, and we ran into David Stovall, who's a good colleague and friend out of Chicago, and began to go to all these panels, right? And in these panels, one of the things that was so incredible was the ways in which these mothers would ask questions, disrupting even in spaces that claim to be about racial justice and ethnic studies, asking questions like, what do you mean by community? Because we talk about community in ways, we talk about community without community in these spaces and never really think about the community as more of a verb than a noun. It's a process that has to be nurtured. It's contested, it's debated, it's complicated, right? And so in every sort of panel they went to, they had these moments. I'll share a couple of those experiences. One was we entered a panel where right at the very end, this historian basically had studied a large data set around Chicanx history in the US. And so we walked in just as he was saying, and so my thesis basically ends with that, if you're an uneducated parent, your child is going to be uneducated. And I remember feeling the rage of these mothers going like, Vero, as soon as the Q&A opens up, you're going to translate our question, right? And sure enough, the moment that it opened up, or La Señora Oliva, who's right in the middle of this photo, tells me, Vero, I want you to ask them, so I am the quote unquote uneducated parent that you have dubbed in your research, but I do not see our children as uneducated. How do we fit your thesis, right? How do we fit your theory? And they did this in every panel they went to, disrupting, to use a term that I know WAESN has been building, this question of disruptive pedagogies. They disrupted every session. They had a moment at one Latinx parent involvement panel in which they asked directly to the panelists, okay, so you did all this work on Latino parents, but let me ask you, how many of you have gone back to those families, shared the merits of your work, and actually worked to shift the terrain? Not one of them had. And so La Señora Corny looks at them and says, so tell me then, what is the point of your work? And this happened the whole way. And so on the whole ride back, this is when we actually received the award there at AERA. But the whole ride back, oh, by the way, this is a funny picture because this is the panel in which the historian, who's right here in the middle, was the one that basically said, if you're uneducated, your children are going to be uneducated. But then afterwards, they all wanted to take a picture with them, right? So it's like, but anyway, and the whole ride back to Pasadena, it was a dreaming of like, why can't we be researchers too? Are we not organic intellectuals? Can we not cultivate the kinds of questions that our communities need? And so the whole ride back was dreaming the organization that currently exists, which is Centro de Educación Popular, which is an organization that engages in participatory action research, guided by the leadership of these women, to think about, like, we too can be researchers, we too can engage in inquiry, and moreover, we can engage in inquiry that has direct impact on our communities. So I share this because these are the kinds of things that have driven my, shifted my own questioning in relationship to the academy. This particular picture is a picture of us in La Casita. This is was a grassroots space there in Pasadena that was shared by multiple organizations. And we met every Friday night to talk about power, to learn about theory. We read everything from bell hooks to Antonio Gramsci to Paulo Freire. And we would sit there sort of dreaming and thinking, about what else could we do? How else can we imagine a different world than the current one that we live in? We studied everything from the mothers of East Los Angeles, right? So while we were thinking about the broader theories, we were looking at our local context, our local histories. This is a group of mothers that were fighting to both end the development of a prison in their local community in the 1960s, and then the 1980s evolved into projects of environmental justice. There was an incinerator that was attempted to be built in East Los Angeles, and so the mothers disrupted that process. We learned about the labor center's history, UCLA Labor Center, and the efforts particularly around labor and unions in LA. And then most recently, because the space with the mothers was always an intergenerational space, we learned about youth-led campaigns. So in particular here, the work of the OVAs, and this is Chicanx, Chicana Bicycle Brigade. And so they engage in sort of theoretical projects, but what they do is they bike ride at night in collectives, claiming space in LA that has been rightly taken from them. And so thinking about the ways in which all these movements, again, even local movements, recent and historical movements, shaped our questions. And it led to beautiful projects such as this one, right? So this was a mural that was co-developed between the mothers and their children. And it was a mural that they used in their popular education work to detail the history, how they saw the history of US schooling and the complexities of this, right? And where do they see themselves inserted in that history? But the power of this image is a center point, which is left blank. And this is one of the things that I come back to over and over again in our own work when we think about the centering of joy, because so much of ethnic studies, while rightfully so, is an analysis of power, it's always fundamentally the aim is about joy and happiness in our humanity. And so the center was always left open for us to always think about, where does the history continue? How do we both interrupt but center who we are, center our joy, centers the ways that we make community in our everyday? How do we imagine something else? And so that piece was always fun to engage in conversation with the mothers, because it was always about dreaming. Our relationship wasn't to necessarily the institutions that have caused us so harm. It was about our futures, and these murals made that possible. So these just kind of showcases a bit of the work we did within this organization. And then as I transition here to the last lesson, it's sort of building off the work of the mothers that, one of the things that I've learned in doing community-based work and thinking about, both the mothers, my own mother, but also, as I'm going to share in a second, our local community here in Bellingham, particularly youth-led movements, the importance of how our work must commit to those movements and not to institutions. Raul Bourbon, who you probably saw in a picture, there was a father in there, the one dad in the group. He was an important popular educator for us. And before he passed away several years ago, he always told me, Vero, compartiendo se sigue aprendiendo. There was always the sense that we have to continue to share so we can keep learning. And he's in the spirit of this, he always hearkened this back to the notion that movements, while complicated and messy and hard, were always ones of generosity, of finding ways that we can connect to each other, build with each other, and imagine, what are the ways that our futures both converge, and which ways do our futures different, but nonetheless, finding the ways that our generosity continues to shape that work on the ground. And once again, here I found myself, I came up to Western Washington. I'm still connected to some of the bases back in California, but in essence, I left that work. I left that work to pursue, if you will, a job here at Western. And I try to find my ways in my own work through my work as a researcher, as a teacher, and to find, where can I gravitate, where can I pull and continue to make sure that I don't lose that ethic, that community-driven ethic that was so part of the work in LA. And so I spent my time going to different communities here locally and sharing different data, the different educational disparities that we find ourselves here in Washington. This is an example of that. So I also do a lot of quantitative and demographic work in my research. And so I remember being really proud of this profile to show like pretty blatantly sort of the disparities, right? That are happening when we think of for every 100 students that start school by different ethno-racial locations, like how do then, how many will go on to graduate high school, bachelor's, and so forth. And I remember sharing this and making the point, clearly that this image shows that there are some deep disparities here in Washington State, and how do we then make sense of where do we repair, how do we fix the leaks? So this type of work is known as educational pipeline analysis. And as I shared this work with a group of teachers here at Tulalip, I'll never forget, there was a Native teacher who raised her hand and she said, Vero, I really appreciate, the data profiles, but let me ask you a question. She asked me, what salmon wants to swim through a pipeline? And it struck me, I was asking the wrong questions. And partly the reason I was asking the wrong questions is because I found myself back in spaces that were primarily academizing ethnic studies and racial justice work. We were trying to figure out how to measure, how to compartmentalize, how to situate this within very palatable stories. And her question just threw me off my seat. And I couldn't help but think, I'm not asking the right questions. See, the pipeline is the problem itself, and we oftentimes don't imagine it to be. We just want to fix it. We want to reform it. We want to tinker with it. But maybe we need to reimagine it altogether. And again, this is what ethnic studies seeks, but at the same time, we find ourselves in spaces that we fail to ask the wrong questions, but because we're not in relationship to community. And so I share this because I come back to these moments pretty intentionally in sort of my own work. As we coming back to Western Washington and thinking about, what does it mean in my own work as a professor to build and to remain committed to community-based praxis. And so here I want to highlight in particular the work of our students on our campus. And the time that I've been there, 8 years, it feels like a short time, but now it feels like it's been a minute since I've been at Western. There have been two substantial uprisings of students calling for ethnic studies. The first was the WW Student Assembly for Power and Liberation, many of them made up by students who were at the core of the program that I direct. And they called for something very specific, right? They were calling for an education that centers our humanity. Those efforts by these students, while powerful, remained unheard by the administration. 3 years later, another group takes over the president's office. And again, demands for an education we all need and deserve, calling for the funding of the College of Ethnic Studies, which we used to have but was dismantled. And so in this process, I was working with them as their mentor. I kept asking, what are the movements? What drives you? What are the community-driven processes that drive your work? And so they insisted of going back into the archives of Western, knowing that the same demands were being asked for in 1968 by a group of Black students, calling for a reform, a deep reform in the way that Western engaged educational projects, particularly its the facade of sort of serving students of color. Asking questions such, does integration even exist? Is that even something that's possible despite the lofty mission statements? Calling out white liberals and being really explicit, right, about the ways in which this history is just repeating itself in its current moment. So they asked, and I want to kind of highlight their words, and I promise, Tracy, I'm almost done. We're almost out of time here. I want to make sure we leave time for questions and answers. So they asked here in SAPL, in their statement, in their closing statement, they reminded the university of this history and said in 1968, Black students at WW were openly fighting and resisting the same structures of power we are today. We continue the important work that they started. We honor their words, their spirits, and their strength by leaving you again with this quote. When Western begins to make phony excuses and resist needed changes, we will be forced to look at Western as the enemy to Black and non-white people and act accordingly. In short, there will be no political consequences for political mistakes. And they end with this. They say the movement is not limited to Western, but is connected to others, where students are demanding that they have a power over their own lives, bodies, and histories. As Cristo so beautifully reminds us, this movement is decades old, and we walk in the history of those who came before us. We recognize all forms of oppression have been resisted since their inception. As Hopi elders, June Jordan, Grace Lee Boggs, and Alice Walker continue to remind us, we are the ones we have been waiting for. And so I come back, I wanted to bring this back to the work here locally, our students and our young folks who are leading these movements. And for me, it was a reminder of again, insisting on a relationship to those spaces, not the institution, but the communities that have been most affected by them. And how then do we again, recalibrate what we want to do in ethnic studies? Because again, as someone who is now part of a collective of faculty trying to demand that Western do what it's right when it comes to ethnic studies, we find ourselves often in institutional battles that deplete us in ways and that distract us, quite honestly, into thinking that colonial logics are what are going to save us. But that has never been the case. And so there's these young folks and the movements that they're leading are reminding us that it has to always be community driven and communities that are intergenerational in nature. And so as I close today, and I know we want to spend some time sort of doing Q&A, I wanted to come back and just leave you with this quote from one of the mothers, which again brings us back and sort of full circle to this work, brings it back to my mother and sort of my journey, my tensions, my contradictions, my struggles in this work, but also our collective struggles as we continue to imagine the radical ethnic studies we all need and deserve. I'm going to read it in Spanish, but the translation is on the screen. And she says to me, Vero, la esperanza surge de luchas que resultan de nuestra memoria y experiencia, y al mismo tiempo unen la responsabilidad individual con nuestras metas del cambio. Pero la esperanza no se materializa del aire. Tiene que ser alimentada, desarrollada, debatida, examinada y actuada, para que se convierta en algo real. Esto solo se logra en comunidad. Y toma tiempo, pero siempre vale la pena. Thank you.
Thank you. I have so many questions, but I'm going to go. David Johnson asked a question in the chat. What is the purpose of public education?
Wow. That's a really good question. I mean, I think that, part of where I find myself sort of challenged, right, is maybe the first part of that is defining those two words. The question for me is, who do we define as the public, right? Because I think for too long, and this is where I think ethnic studies for me has been so key, right? We can use terms like the public, but the public has typically meant, and particularly in the context of schooling, has usually been white, heteronormative, cisgender, Judeo-Christian, right? The public has been defined in very specific ways. Now, when we expand that public to include other voices, then the concept of education has to radically shift too. So for me, I mean, this is the complexity of how do we do this work within the context of schooling, because the contradictions run high, and I can say as someone who is deeply troubled and struggling, right? I have more degrees than I care to admit. I have struggled through this context. I almost flunked out of my undergrad. I had a mentor who somehow brought me back. But these kinds of moments of like, what does it mean to be educated? So I say this with complexities, right? In the ways that we think about the purpose of public education. For me, it always goes back, who's public and how do we define education? But I think for me, if we imagine it as a democratic space in which we can all come together to wrestle with ideas, to surface ideologies, to think about, the clashing of worldviews, I think that there's a possibility to generate, I don't shy away from conflict. I think conflict can generate some really interesting questions. But ultimately, I know that the public has never really included BIPOC communities. So I struggle with that, but it's a really important question. And I would just say to kind of just end there, to thinking about the mothers were always very much invested in public campaigns around this. Their classrooms were always open to everyone. I think that's, for me, the best model of public education that I can think of, right? La Casita, Friday nights from 5 to 10 o'clock with La Señora Oliva's buñuelos that everybody loved, right? With children on the floor also listening in. I think about the types of lessons that were about, not just about learning a new content, but also about healing from old wounds. So that's how I would approach that question. And I hope I answered it.
Thank you. Okay, this is another one. Students often feel like they have no choice, and this is from V, because the law doesn't protect them and it doesn't listen to them because they can't vote. How do you show them that they can protect themselves, if they can stand up to make a change when they stand together, that they can do that even in the midst of a pandemic?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I think this pandemic has really, it's been interesting, right? Because clearly we're navigating through ongoing heartache. And I think our young folks are experiencing it the hardest, right? But what's also been made interesting is what the pandemic in sort of interesting ways has also made available, right? And I say that with a caveat, because I know I want to recognize that this has not been an easy time. Like, we are in the middle of a disaster on all kinds of levels. But, I'm talking to my Native colleagues at Western who are doing some beautiful work with our local tribal communities. I remember one of them said, gosh, Beto, I never imagined from one day to the next, there would be no age segregation. Like, our young folks are returning back home to reconnect to the lessons of home in ways that we never would have imagined that this would be possible, right? So, one of the things that I think, and then watching these campaigns, with the sort of digital literacies, while at the same time still recognizing there's a digital divide for sure, right, in several of our communities, but the ways that young folks have taken up digital literacies and technologies and launch campaigns and build networks. I mean, there's ways that when I was in, coming up in my 20s or late teens, I would have never imagined, we were still using blowhorns, right? I was still trying to figure out how to work a pager. And it's not to kind of diminish, again, like I said, the heartache, but I think that there are moments of opportunities in ways that we might not expect. So one of the things in working with our youth on campus, and also in connected to our Bellingham community, is finding those platforms where young people are already at, finding ways to connect, finding ways to build. Social media surely is complicated, and there's other things that we can definitely spend hours critiquing it. But when it's done well and when it's engaged well to build solidarity and to engage in relationship building, it has the power to really reach places we would have never imagined, and to reach young folks in ways that we would never imagine. So outside of the right to vote, one of the things that I'm witnessing now is that had it not been for youth-led movements, post-Ferguson, the youth-led movements for environmental justice, the youth-led movements around all these campaigns, right? And even now, I mean, like I said, my colleague works with preschoolers, and they're leading sort of efforts and campaigns to recenter land and water in the ways we think about critical pedagogies in sort of the early years of school. These movements would not happen. And it's young folks that are making evident that, our institutions are simply not serving their needs. So I say this because I think that we are challenged. We are clearly challenged in this pandemic, finding ways to navigate, feeling like, we don't have the institutional vote, that we don't have power. But quite, if we look at movements historically, it's been movements of those that have been denied access. I mean, denied access to vote, denied access to institutions, that have opened spaces for us to generate new worlds and new possibilities. And those are primarily youth. And so I always tell my students at Western, I'm like, the two groups that have always led movements for change have always been young folks and women and femmes. Those are the two groups that have always led the work forward. And so I honor them here. And so I would love to talk to you more, because I feel like there's so much that I would love to connect you with and to hear more. But thank you so much for the question.
Okay, these two I'm going to combine because I think one you can answer quickly. Dr. Kenosha says, Dr. Velez, thank you for sharing the ongoing struggle at Western with our current students. What are the demands? So that's the first one. And then the second one comes from one of our youth advisory board members at WAESN, Siona. And she asked, how do we organize for anti-racist education and a more inclusive culture at predominantly white institutions?
Very good. Yes, Dr. Kenosha. Also, by the way, I think you are speaking at our event at Western next month. So I'm really excited to connect with you. And I'm more than happy. And actually, Tracy, I might be able to just send you the actual documents if you want to share that publicly. They're public, but I can send them to you to share publicly with the group, because it has some of them, like the sample document was like 10 pages long, right? And the 2018 demands, I think, were about equally in the same length, but they were asking for multiple things in there. Both of them were calling, SAPL was calling for a College of Ethnic Studies, which they called the College of Power Liberation. And then the 2018 demands were a demand specifically for the College of Ethnic Studies. But in that, they were very clear around things like the constant exploitation of labor of BIPOC staff, faculty, and students, to be frank. They were calling for a reorganization of things like the Multicultural Center and who actually has control of Multicultural Center resources. They were calling, in the 2018 memos, they were calling for explicit firing of folks. I mean, so there's very specific things that, but I'm happy to send you those documents. But the thing that was very clear in both the documents was, why has Western continued to remain ahistorical to these conversations? What happened to the College of Ethnic Studies? Why did it end, right? Because the narrative out there is that it imploded from the inside. And I think it's a much more complicated narrative than that. That's a narrative that they want us to hear. And in that ask were, also specific questions around who gets to determine what will become the college in the future of ethnic studies. But all that to say that I'm happy to share those documents to look at sort of the specific asks of students. And the thing that was so powerful about the students on our campus, and again, thinking about the digital literacies and tech stuff, was that they were connected with other student groups across the country, building networks, sharing sort of documents, demands. That would have felt like almost an impossibility in my time, right? Like these are moments where you can see where, these things have the digital sort of advancements have allowed young folks to really engage with each other in ways that would have never been possible. But I'm happy to share that. And Tracy, remind me the second question.
How do you organize for anti-racism in predominantly white institutions?
Okay. So, yes. So one of the things that I have been really critical of, and I see this happen over and over again, we have become very good in higher ed of doing this kind of multicultural light workshop justice kind of approach to this work. And universities, when you look on pamphlets, when you look online, can seem really progressive. I mean, if you actually literally pull up Western Washington's, you'll find probably, it looks like it's the most diverse university in the world. It has all these things. I think at one point the powwow opened up one of the videos, and Indigenous students had a lot to say about that on our campus because the university actually refused to fund it. So all the ways in which these kind of messages, these discourses around diversity, equity, and inclusion fall far short from the things that students and communities are asking for when it comes to racial justice. So the first thing we have to remember is to not equate those two things, right? Now, in terms of my work, one of the things that I have struggled with, right, is what does it mean to be employed, paid for, paid by an institution, work for an institution, but at the same time never become of the institution. And that for me is a very important distinction. For a lot of us in the program that I direct, the Education and Social Justice minor, we've had to really develop learning communities outside the formal construct of school. My beautiful sister at Western, Dr. Kristen French, who directs the Center for Education, Equity, and Diversity called SEED, has built this sort of radical space, literally in the basement of the College of Education. And that is where we gather, right? So we find these spaces to build learning communities outside of the gaze of institutional intervention, right? And I often have to tell students, even in their fight for ethnic studies, I have to ask them, what version of ethnic studies do you think Western will give you, right? Because at the end of the day, we have to continue to build in ways that are outside of the confines of those structures, even as we continue to hold those institutions accountable. So one thing is harm reduction, right? Which is, thinking about the ways that we work in conjunction and solidarity to shift those terrains. But another thing is, how do we continue to nurture spaces outside of those institutions where we can dream outside of the gaze of institutional surveillance? So I say that because I think that for me, what has held us has been those spaces, cultivating those spaces, the investments in building those networks. The Education and Social Justice minor, and I say this not because of anything I necessarily did, this has always been a collective of folks building this, but I would say that one of the things that has been really clear for us is, I think in sort of ensuring that at the end of the day, like ethnic studies rests with us, and it doesn't become another project that the university will flip into reordering it within its structure. But the Education and Social Justice minor is primarily a student of color, queer, first gen, undocumented space for that reason. And it's become that because we've ensured to maintain the sacredness of that work, even if it means working in the basement after hours, right? And that's something that we'll have to continue to think about and wrestle in the work of ethnic studies within institutions, because it puts a lot of labor on folks who are really committed to constantly work outside of those spaces to make things possible. And it's something that I'm still wrestling with, right? But that's how I would respond to that question. I think it's constantly working to cultivate spaces, even within, that are outside of the bounds of institutional surveillance. And I'm happy to share more in terms of the specific things we did, but I could say we met in homes, basement, Kristen's kitchen table. Like, I mean, we just, we're constantly figuring out ways to create other schools, if you will, outside of our current schooling.
Okay, thank you. We are out of time. I think we could listen to you talk all day. I'm getting, my texts are blowing up saying the keynote is giving me life right now. So thank you. There are still more questions. There's a question on how to do ethnic studies as a white educator. There's a breakout for that. Join the breakout for that. And then there's another question on how the youth organizing was started. There's also a breakout for that with the NAACP Youth Council and WAESN's own youth advisory board. And then Felina, I've been talking to a lot. She's down in Tucson and she's a new teacher, and she has questions about that. So Felina, I'm going to connect you with Vero in email, and y'all can talk offline. And so
don't mind, Tracy, but I'm taking pictures of all the questions in the chat because I'm
okay,
like, to folks. So if you see me off, that's because I'm taking pictures so that I can find a way to make sure I respond to folks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for putting this all in context. It was perfectly framed for our work for today. You might have a little bit of trouble getting into some of the links because I have to log off and log into some of the links. So we're going to give like a 5-minute transition time. So for facilitators, if you could wait till like 11:05 to start, and then we'll get everybody moved over. So we're going to leave this call. You're going to click on the next link that you want to join. And thank you, Dr. Velez, so much again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I feel honored. I'll see you in the breakout sessions. I'm going to join a couple.
Cool. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.